Hi, everybody. It's my pleasure to introduce the keynote address for this evening. Melissa Fleming. Melissa Fleming is the head of communications and chief spokesperson for UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, working to draw attention, drive empathy, and generate support for the world's 68 million refugees and displaced people. She uses strategic communications to reach target audiences that include media, public, governments, and refugees themselves. Melissa believes in the power of public speaking to move audiences. Her TED Talks have been viewed by more than 3 million people around the world. Most recently, Melissa published a book entitled A Hope More Powerful Than the Sea that compels us all to look at the refugee crisis with more empathy and urgency. Everybody, Melissa Fleming.
Great to see you all. Thank you, Layla, and thank you very much for having me here at Stanford. It's really a pleasure. There is a saying, and that is, statistics are human beings with the tears dried off. As somebody who is responsible for building empathy for people forced to flee from their homes, I really, really don't like statistics. However, and Layla mentioned actually one, and can I, the presentation isn't here. It is? Oh. Okay. So, can you just, here we go. So, I want to ask you how you feel when you see this figure, 29,000 people. Can anybody guess why I'm putting up this figure? What does it mean? It's the it represents the number, according to our recent trends, the number of people who will flee today, who will close the doors of their homes without perhaps ever getting the chance to open them again, caught up in the hell of war, fleeing to save their lives. But how do we imagine 29,000 people? These are really difficult times to be a refugee, and I'm sorry to have to throw up another statistic, and that is the figure of almost 70 million people. Layla was using a statistic from last year. We're going to be announcing our new statistics this year, and it's going to be preview many, many more than there were last year. And it's a difficult time because, you know, there are, as we say, we've been saying this every year we go out and announce the statistics, that there are record numbers of people forcibly displaced. There are more people who are forcibly displaced since in World War II. And difficulties for people are growing. We're making sweeping progress in so many other areas, the Sustainable Development Goals, human health, as you're all working on here now, innovating technologies, but we are moving backwards sometimes, it seems, in preventing and stopping the wars that are driving so many people from their homes. And we are doing dangerously little to help the victims and the countries that host them. So this is what they fled and what they flee. This is a photo that I took recently in Homs, which was once a UNESCO World Heritage Site in Syria. I walked down the street of Homs and I met this little boy, and he just looked at me without expression on his face and said, "This missile killed my father." And I just wonder, when we're thinking about these big numbers, how many of us ever get to know this boy's story and whether the end of his story will ever be told. I think we all have to ask the question to ourselves, do we feel empathy when we're faced with images like this one that was taken on the border of Hungary in 2015? Do you feel empathy when you see images of large numbers of people at the borders of the United States? Or does the condition that social psychologists call psychic numbing set in? I have to ask myself this question often too as a communicator. A friend of mine who's a social scientist named Paul Slovic has studied what he calls the arithmetic of compassion, and he's found that when the public are presented with large numbers, this sets in. The more who die, the less we care. Even worse, communicating statistics can cause a backlash. It can stoke fear. It can be used in toxic, demonizing language of politics, language that is fueling hatred of foreigners. It's exploiting images of desperate masses. It's speaking of invasions. It's using frightening terms such as swarms, and it's linking the arrival of refugees and migrants with terrorism or disease outbreaks. The use, and we know this from history, of language that dehumanizes people fleeing conflict has a long and tragic history in Europe and in elsewhere. And I fear that the politics of fear is overtaking the politics of compassion. It's language that is stoking hatred and possibly even leading to the kinds of horrific violence that we saw in Christchurch recently. But also, to note, a very positive example of leadership by the Prime Minister there, and an example that we finally were seeing of a wonderful and welcoming country for refugees, kind of torn apart by a hateful individual. So, why should we care? Why should we care about refugees? Well, we know refugees are innocent victims of war persecution, that their exile represents wars that are raging unresolved, and that large populations live in limbo for years or even decades. We know and we learn in the press that they are Syrians, they are now Venezuelans, they are South Sudanese, they are Afghans, and they're fleeing so, very simply, they won't have to die. They're fleeing to save their daughters from rape, their sons from jail, or forced recruitment. We read in the news that they face an uncertain future when they arrive at the borders of countries that either welcome them or confine them or even turn them away. Where, if they are lucky, they are granted asylum, allowed to settle in a community, work, and put their children in local schools. But all too often, like little Ashraf here, they are confined to a refugee settlement in a muddy field and may or may not have the chance to go to school. They often are dependent on humanitarian aid, or they're living in poverty in cities and not permitted to work. We also know that the vast majority of the world's refugees, and that is 85%, are living in developing or poor countries. Not, as the news would have you believe, here in the United States or in Europe. These are generous countries, neighboring wars, faced, although, with massive problems of their own. And for kids, this means entire childhood spent in limbo. And refugees have generally a lot of time in limbo. Many of you probably imagine that being a refugee is a temporary status, but it's far from it. With wars going on and on with no peaceful solution, refugees spend an average of, and this is not totally scientific, but it is around 17 years in exile. So again, why should we care? Because we believe if even you don't feel the compassion for the individual refugees, not investing in refugees is a huge missed opportunity. Leave them abandoned, like this little girl who I met in Iraq, who I went up to and tried to make her laugh and tried to make her smile. I had the feeling she couldn't. I already had the feeling that she felt abandoned. Leave them abandoned, and they risk exploitation and abuse. Leave them unskilled and uneducated, and delay by years the return of peace and prosperity to their countries. So I believe how we treat the uprooted will shape the future of our world. The victims of war can hold the keys to lasting peace, and it is the refugees who can stop the cycle of violence. I told, and I'm speaking in very general terms, and I was telling you that I don't like to use statistics, so I'm going to tell you the story that of all the stories of all the refugees, and I wish I could tell all almost 70 million of them, because they're all incredibly striking, and everybody has survived hell, and all people have incredible resilience. But Doa Al-Zamal was, her story captured my heart, and I wrote a book about it called A Hope More Powerful Than the Sea, and I'm just going to give you a very short summary, because her experience represents, first of all, the experience of the Syrian war, but I think probably of almost every refugee. So Doa grew up as a young refugee in Dara in Syria, where, as you probably recall, if you know a little bit about the origin of the Syrian war, this is where the peaceful demonstrations began. And a very long story short, she was caught up in this. She witnessed when the bombs started falling on her town and the tanks started rolling in, and the friends of hers were being shot at. Her father's barbershop was bombed, and they made the decision, like so many other refugees, to flee. She ended up in Egypt, in despair, longing for her home, her bedroom, her books. A man, another Syrian refugee named Bassem, fell madly in love with her at first sight. She, being extremely stubborn, and this is a very important quality for the rest of this story, made him wait for at least months and months, and resort to almost taking rat poison and threatening to go back to Syria, until finally she agreed. That actually she did like him. They fell in love. And he started saying, Doa, this is no life here in Egypt. He was working a factory job. She wasn't going to school. She was laboring also to bring in some money for her parents. She had aspirations to go to university. And he said, Doa, let's take one of these boats and go to Europe. And he showed her pictures of his friends. One of them was in Munich, and the other one was in Amsterdam, standing in front of a canal and one of these famous bridges. One of them was in school, the other one was working. And he said, we can get married, we can work, we can study. He finally convinced her to go, even though she had a near-drowning experience and never learned to swim. And one day, in the dark of the night, they boarded a boat that looked like this. It wasn't the beautiful cruise ship that the smugglers had promised them that was going to safely take them to the shores of Italy. It was a stinking, rotting, decrepit fishing boat. And when she and Bassem were brought out to the boat and she was lifted onto the edge, she saw that there were hundreds of other refugees already on board, including 100 children, including these two children, Masa and Sarah. Masa was 18 months and Sarah is 6 years old. They were crammed together, shoulder to shoulder and feet to feet, and 4 days and 4 nights on that boat. A pretty ugly and terrifying experience, but nothing prepared them for what was going to happen on the 4th morning in the water. Doa looked over her shoulder and saw a boat approaching, and it started ramming a hole in the side of Doa and Bassem's boat. And as it sped away and returned and came back to ram the boat again, Doa heard as the men on board shouted, "Let the fish eat your flesh." And they laughed as they sped away, and the boat started sinking in the sea. And Doa was saying, "Oh, please, no, not drowning." And she lost the grip of Bassam as he slid into the water, and she was holding on to the side of the boat. And Bassam was yelling, "Please, jump in." And he managed to find her a child's floating ring that looked like this. Um, and I could spend the whole talk, describing what happened in the next 4 days in the water. But on day 2, an old man approached Doa and Bassam, who was treading water next to Doa, and said, "Doa, Bassam, please take this little child." It was a little baby who was 8 months old. Her name was Malik. "Please take this child as if she were your own. I just lost 27 members of my family, and I can't go on." And the little girl in the pink pajamas with 2 front teeth nestled on Doa's chest and became calm. But later that day, as people were dropping off, even taking their life vests off and committing suicide in the water out of despair, when nobody came to rescue them, Bassam said to Doa, "I'm sorry, my love, I can't go on. You're the love of my life, but I can't survive." And she watched as the love of her life drowned before her eyes. When Doa was rescued after 4 days and 4 nights in the water, she had 2 babies clutched to her chest. Another mother, I showed you that picture of the 2 children at the beginning, had given over her little daughter, Masa, to Doa and entrusted her with her. And Doa, this probably also gave Doa the will to survive. When this rescue boat, came across Doa and the babies, they couldn't believe that she had survived this, and this is the babies in the boat. One of them, little Masa, pulled through. This is her in the hospital in Crete. The news, when it circulated around Greece and then wider, that a little girl, only 18 months old, had survived 4 days and 4 nights on the water, and a 19-year-old had rescued her. All these calls came in wanting to adopt the little girl. Doa, meanwhile, was recovering in a hospital, another hospital in Crete, and an Egyptian family, had taken her in, and messages started coming in on Facebook. "Doa, do you know what happened to my brother, my sister, my mother?" One of those messages said, "Doa, I think that you saved my niece," and sent this picture of little Masa. And it was Masa's uncle, who was a refugee in Sweden. So in the end, and this is a very long story short, Doa did make it to Sweden thanks to UNHCR's resettlement program for vulnerable young people. We were able to reunite her with her family, who were in Egypt and who were being threatened. She's learning Swedish. She's getting used to the freezing cold and the snow. And she's been going with me on book tours, and she's an advisor to the film that is going to be made on the book, Spielberg and J.J. Abrams' film. So wonderful. But I can't help asking, why did Doa have to go through all of that in the first place? What if she didn't have to take that risk? What if there had been a legal chance for her to get a visa to study, or Masa had been able to unite with her family in Sweden and not have to travel on that boat? Or if Bassam could have had some way to find decent work in Egypt, and they wouldn't have felt so compelled to move on. Why is there no massive resettlement program for Syrian refugees and many of the other refugees living in very vulnerable and compelling circumstances? The world did this for the Vietnamese in the 1970s when 1 million people reached new lives in safety. Why not now? And why are the neighboring countries and communities hosting, as I've said, those 85% of the world's refugees, not being offered the funding and the support that would be needed to really manage this large population? Of course, the root question, why is so little being done to stop the wars that are driving so many people to flee and take these desperate journeys? The simple truth is that refugees would not risk their lives on a journey so dangerous if they could thrive where they are. And migrants fleeing grinding poverty would not be on those boats if they could feed themselves and their children. And nobody would resort to those notorious smugglers with their life savings if they could apply to migrate legally. So until these problems are addressed, people will continue to cross the seas, endangering their lives to seek asylum. And no refugee should have to die trying to escape limbo. And no refugee, and this is just the news today, should be in a situation where they're rescued on the Mediterranean, but there's no port that will take them in. So we should think of refugee camps and communities as more than just temporary population centers where people languish and wait for the war to end. People are aspirational. We all want a better life. We should think rather of places where refugees are as centers of excellence, where refugees can triumph over their trauma, contribute to their communities, and train for the day when they can return home, to be agents of positive change and social transformation, places where refugees can thrive, not just survive. So in the refugees situations I visit, what bothers me most is to see refugee children missing out on school. And the truth is that only half of the world's refugees are in school. When it gets to the secondary level, it is a miserable 1/3. And at the university level, it's only 1%. In August 2015, I think you'll recall, a lot of you, these pictures. Tens of thousands of refugees from Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan started arriving on the shores of Greece and making their way to countries like Austria, Germany, and Sweden. European governments were taken by surprise. But UNHCR surveyed the refugees arriving, and the top question that parents answered when we asked, "Why did you come?" was because they said, "Because I want to put my children in school." The young people said, "So I can be safe and I can study." So, in fact, all refugee children I meet tell me that education is the most important thing in their lives. Why? Because it allows them to think of hope rather than hatred, of their future rather than the nightmare of their past. So many of them will not have seen the inside of a classroom for months of years, but children are remarkably resilient. And I just wanted to throw this picture up. I recently met these girls in the Kakuma refugee camp in northern Kenya, who had just graduated from high school and were at the top of their class. But again, that 1% statistic comes in. Will they have the chance to study? Will they have the chance to move on? When we do help refugee children and students, amazing things happen. I'm going to tell you a story of somebody who's really special to me to conclude my talk. It's somebody that might ring a bell in a second. His name is Jacob Adam, and he was just 7 when he watched his village in Sudan burn to the ground. His mom and dad were killed that day. He and his older cousin walked for months, like the boys in this photo. I think you maybe have heard of them. They're referred to as the Lost Boys of Sudan. They survived in a terrain where wild animals and armed groups were on the hunt and food was very scarce. And he spent most of his childhood, 9 years, in refugee camps in Ethiopia and also the Kakuma refugee camp, like where those girls were living. But he got his real break when he was resettled to the United States, and he finished high school there before going on to university. And he agreed that he could share this picture of this proud moment with you. But now he is here with us today, and it's something even more remarkable. He has just finished his postdoctorate degree. He's standing here. Can you stand up, Jacob? At the Center of Humanitarian Health at Johns Hopkins, and I'm so excited because I've wanted to meet him for the last several years, and it's amazing. So when you invest in refugees, when your government runs programs like Ann Richard used to do, and resettle refugees to our countries that really have the ability to take care of them and give them this chance, really amazing things can happen. Unfortunately, those resettlement numbers, even though the needs are growing, are shrinking. But let me leave you here with some hope, because this has been kind of depressing, I think. Last December, at the United Nations, the Global Compact on Refugees was adopted. It's a new blueprint for refugee response. I think, UNHCR and the member states had recognized that business as usual was not going to work to take care of the refugee population of our times. So in it, wealthy countries recognize the humanity of the countries taking in the majority of refugees, and they pledge to do much more to invest in those infrastructures in those communities where refugees mostly are. The private sector will now be invited to improve refugee lives with projects in areas of energy, jobs, and education. It's going to be made much easier for them to do that. And I think Leila's project here is an amazing example of how a university can meaningfully contribute to refugee response. Refugee students are going to have better chances if this all works to go to school and to access higher education, and there'll be more legal avenues for refugees to resettle, to study, and to work in other countries. And importantly, the signatories to the compact also reaffirm that no refugee fleeing war will face a closed border and be sent back to harm's way. So let's speak about refugees not as needy masses on the move, but as deserving, resilient human beings who need all our help to restart their lives. Let's make our voices louder than the voices of those who spread hate. Let's care. It's an investment in humanity and also in peace. Thank you very much.